What would you do if you walked into the company you just acquired, only to be mistaken for a delivery man because of the color of your skin? Malcolm Rhodes didn't need to raise his voice. He simply looked back, and that moment set off a chain reaction no one saw coming. Blank stares, demeaning words, and a stunning reversal of fate, all in just 14 minutes. So where does power really lie? In titles, business cards, or in the silence that speaks louder than any voice? This story will hold your attention from the very first second. If you've ever been judged by your appearance, drop a comment below saying, "Now I understand." And don't forget to hit subscribe, because each episode uncovers a hidden truth you won't want to miss. Malcolm Rhodes, a successful black entrepreneur, walked into the sleek glass atrium of Astoria Global Holdings carrying a brown leather briefcase, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, and armed with a vision that could reshape the financial world. He was ready for the meeting that would make history, but instead of being greeted with the respect his position deserved, the receptionist, Naomi Carrington, cut him off coldly, pointed to the exit, and said, "Deliveries go around back. This area is for internal staff only." Not a single head turned, not one glance of concern. And Rowan Mercer, a young intern seated quietly at the tea counter, watched it all unfold, his hands tightening around his coffee cup. He once dreamed of working here, believing this place stood for equality and merit. But now he sat frozen, forced to witness an insult that mirrored every fear he'd buried deep. An insult hurled not at Malcolm alone, but at him too, because of the color of his skin. Naomi didn't notice Malcolm's eyes in that moment. No anger, no sharp retort, just a quiet weight, like a man who's lived this same humiliation too many times to count and learned how to swallow it without flinching. In 12 silent seconds, a high-rise built on ethics revealed its core. Where values are preached, a single glance still decides your worth. Now let me ask you, if you were Malcolm, would you walk away quietly, or would you do something that makes the entire system stop and take notice? In the Westvale atrium, when Naomi Carrington looked at Malcolm like he was just another nobody, what hit him first wasn't anger. It was something far more painful: recognition. That look, he'd seen it before, in different cities, different offices, different faces. But this time, it was inside a building that once called him a co-architect of the future. No one spoke up, but the security cameras kept rolling, cold, impartial, and unforgivingly accurate. The first impact didn't come from Naomi. It came from the very system itself. The access cards, the sliding doors, the quiet architecture of exclusion, telling you exactly who belongs and who doesn't. Naomi didn't mean to discriminate, but with a name, a suit, and skin that didn't match her assumptions, her brain reacted before her judgment could catch up. She didn't know Malcolm. All she saw was a confident black man walking into the building, and her instincts filled in the rest. Malcolm didn't say a word, but that silence wasn't surrender. It was a statement, a quiet defiance that shifted the air around him. The kind of stillness that makes an entire room pause. Rowan Mercer watched it all, and he couldn't look away. For the first time in his life, he witnessed a man of color being humiliated. Right in front of him, and no one did anything. A flicker of guilt sparked in Rowan's chest, small but real, a fire waiting to spread. What no one in the lobby knew was that up on the 18th floor, the executive boardroom was preparing a slideshow, and Malcolm's face was front and center, labeled "The Visionary Redefining Corporate Innovation." Just a few floors apart, and yet it felt like two separate worlds. And that sharp contrast, that brutal disconnect, was the first crack in Astoria's polished facade of moral leadership. She motioned for security to escort Malcolm out. Right there, in the center of the lobby, under the indifferent gaze of dozens of Astoria employees. No one intervened. Not a single voice spoke up. Only Rowan Mercer remained frozen, his face pale, his hand gripping tightly onto the small USB drive in his pocket, the one Malcolm had handed him during a quiet conversation months ago, when Rowan was still just a nameless intern hoping to be seen. 1 hour later, on the 18th floor, the executive board sat waiting for their guest speaker. Whispers began to ripple through the room when Malcolm failed to appear, And just as the silence thickened, Rowan stood up. He didn't say a word. He simply walked to the projector and inserted the USB. Frame by frame, the screen came to life. The lobby footage, Naomi's cold stare, Malcolm's quiet devastation, the mocking tone of the security guard, and the haunting stillness of the witnesses who said nothing. No subtitles, no voiceover. The truth spoke for itself. The room fell into a silence so dense it felt like breath was being held in every chest. And then a voice, Malcolm's. Not in person, but in a short audio clip sent to the board. I didn't come to punish, I came to awaken. No outrage, no threats of legal action, just a message, clear, powerful, and disarmingly calm. Naomi sat still, her cheeks burning with shame. But instead of fleeing, she turned to the screen and sat down again. Not to defend herself, but to finally listen. Rowan was asked to present the partnership proposal in Malcolm's place. A young man once silent, now trusted to speak on behalf of change. And from that meeting forward, Astoria's guest protocol wasn't revised by a PR committee, but redrafted from the heart of a wound that demanded healing. Rowan Mercer, a young black intern, had stayed silent when Malcolm was humiliated. But after playing that video, he didn't leave the boardroom. He stayed until the very end, long after the powerful had lowered their heads one by one. Not for himself, but because he knew that if he stayed silent today, no one would dare speak tomorrow. That's also why, when the media swarmed Malcolm Rhodes with interview requests, talk show invitations, and million-dollar endorsement deals, he turned them all down. I'm not a victim. I'm not a symbol. I'm just a human being, and I hope we start seeing each other that way. A week later, Astoria hosted an internal forum to address cultural reform, but standing on the stage wasn't the CEO, nor the head of HR. It was Rowan, the same young man once denied a voice, now speaking for an entire generation ready to be heard. This company once taught me how to stay silent, but Malcolm's story taught me how to use truth to heal. At the back of the auditorium, Naomi Carrington, the woman who had humiliated Malcolm, stepped forward. She didn't flinch from the cameras. She didn't hold a script. She didn't offer excuses. She simply bowed her head and said, "I'm not apologizing to be forgiven. I'm apologizing because I want to start again, from a better version of myself." There were no applause, just a deep, heavy silence, the kind that forces people to confront who they are. Astoria didn't change because they feared a scandal. They changed because they reached the edge of what was morally acceptable, and thankfully, they weren't too late. At the end of the viral video that followed, the last image was of Malcolm walking out of the Westvale atrium. No grand farewell, just his figure fading into the distance, stepping through the glass doors, reflecting not just a man, but a new hope beginning to rise. Malcolm Rhodes didn't say a word, not a flash of anger, not a single glance of blame. He simply stood there, in the cold corridor of the Westvale atrium, and looked at Rowan Mercer. Not with disappointment, but with something deeper, a silent message that needed no sound. Rowan gave the slightest nod, like he had just inherited a legacy not written in ink, but in spirit. He didn't chase after Malcolm. He just stood still, as if guarding a sacred silence, the kind that doesn't end things, but begins something bigger. Online, the video spread, but it didn't have a clickbait title, no dramatic captions, just the quiet moment a black man was dismissed by unconscious bias, and a young intern stood witness. No one expected that just days later, Astoria would announce a new hiring, promotion, and training policy, led by a task force that now included a name few had known before, Rowan Mercer. People began talking about the silence policy, not a written document, but a code of ethics woven into how we respond when silence fills the room. At the end of the clip, one final line faded in, soft as a breath. Silence isn't surrender. Sometimes it's the only way words gain weight. If you've ever been misunderstood because of your skin, your voice, or your story, let this remind you, you are not alone. And if you believe justice doesn't begin with shouting, but with silence that holds meaning, leave a comment below. Because maybe you are the one who will write the next chapter of this story. That same afternoon, the lights blazed inside Horizon Hall, Astoria's largest boardroom. Inside, the executive team sat in anticipation, their faces composed, waiting for the official partner from Novatech Capital. The doors opened. 1 second of stunned silence. The black man who had been escorted out that very morning, Malcolm Rhodes, walked in. No introduction, no nameplate. His eyes scanned the room slowly. Then, without a word, he placed his leather briefcase on the glass table. The air froze. Naomi Carrington, still in her receptionist uniform, instinctively stepped back. Rowan Mercer, seated quietly at the far corner, held his breath. But this time, he pulled out his phone. Not to record, to play. The footage was from the lobby's security camera. Every detail, the dismissive shake of Naomi's head, the harsh command to take it to the loading dock, played out in front of them all. No one interrupted. No one denied what was playing. The truth was too loud to ignore. But then, Malcolm raised his hand. The video stopped. He didn't accuse. He didn't lash out. He simply said, "I didn't come here for revenge. I came to ask you to wake up before you're the ones being pushed out of the very building you helped build." 1 minute of silence followed. Heavy, still, almost reverent. And slowly, one by one, from the CEO to the assistants, they began to look inward. Not out of fear, but because, for the first time, they encountered a kind of power they couldn't command. The power of composure and truth. Malcolm stood still for a moment before placing his hand on the remote. The light from the projector bathed the entire boardroom as the security footage played. Every word, every gesture, every dismissive glance, and his own quiet pain laid bare. No narration, no dramatic edits. The truth didn't need help to be heard. The room was silent. Naomi lowered her head. A few executives whispered uneasily. But then, something happened that no one expected. Malcolm didn't make a closing statement. He didn't demand a firing. He didn't call anyone out by name. Instead, he turned to Rowan Mercer, the young intern standing nervously in the corner, clutching a folder. "Rowan, are you willing to change how this story ends?" One question, but it felt like the passing of a torch. No script, no prompting. And Rowan, hands still trembling, stepped forward and placed a proposal titled Multidimensional Inclusion Policy onto the boardroom table. No one stopped him. No one laughed. And for the first time, an intern spoke in a high-level executive meeting, not because of title, but because his witnessing had become a voice. When he finished, the room didn't erupt in applause. It shifted, subtly, powerfully. The nods came from the very people who once looked right through him. A door opened that day, not for Malcolm, but for Rowan, because sometimes change doesn't come from those in power, but from the one who dares to break the silence first. The security footage didn't just expose an act of disrespect, it revealed something even more unsettling. A quiet, deep-rooted disregard woven into the fabric of the company's culture. All eyes turned to Naomi Carrington. Her face had gone pale, not because she'd been caught, but because, for the first time, she saw herself through someone else's silence. She didn't make excuses. She didn't retreat. She simply stood up and walked toward the front, like someone about to deliver a final word, but instead chose to speak the first line of a new chapter. "I wasn't forced to apologize. I'm here to relearn from the very man I once couldn't even look in the eye." No one interrupted. No one jumped in to save her, and no one tore her down. In a room that once dressed bias in professional language, Naomi's admission struck like a fist through the invisible wall everyone had quietly learned to ignore. Rowan looked at her, not with anger, but with something closer to disbelief. Malcolm showed no expression, but his gaze slowly drifted away from Naomi, as if he was allowing time to reset, but not to erase. It was Naomi who proposed that the footage be included in the company's mandatory training, co-led by herself and Rowan, not to cleanse her mistake, but to live with it and ensure it never happened again. Because sometimes real change doesn't come from punishment. It comes from the courage to face yourself before the world forces you to. The air in the boardroom was suffocating. Heads were bowed, a few faces flushed with shame. But no one walked out of that room the same. One senior executive whispered, "We've let this go on far too long." And for the first time, Change didn't come from a memo or a mandate. It came from a moment of reflection. No one was forced. No punishments were handed down. Yet that very afternoon, Astoria's executive board held an emergency vote to introduce a new clause into the company's code of conduct, the unconscious respect standard, co-authored by Rowan Mercer and Naomi Carrington, an intern, and the very person who had once made the mistake, now sitting side by side, signing a proposal titled, "Respect is not assumed, it's practiced." Malcolm wasn't there anymore. He had left before the meeting ended, but the seed he planted had already taken root. He didn't need applause. He didn't need apologies. What he left behind was a living policy, born not from outrage, but from a single powerful silence. Rowan stepped out of the boardroom, holding the draft in his hands like a responsibility that outweighed his title. As he glanced back at the empty chair where Malcolm once sat, one thought echoed in his mind. Sometimes the quietest man in the room is the one who makes everyone else finally speak up. No one expected what happened next. When the head of communications suggested holding a public press conference to issue an apology and discipline those involved, Malcolm simply nodded gently and stood. His eyes drifted toward Naomi, still seated, head bowed, fingers interlocked tightly as if trying to hide the redness in her eyes. "I don't need revenge. I need awakening." The words carried no anger, no condemnation, but they weighed heavier than any punishment ever could. The room seemed to freeze. A few nodded slowly. Others held their breath. But it was Rowan's eyes that stood out most, lit with a quiet realization that would stay with him for life. Forgiveness isn't weakness. It's the highest form of strength. Malcolm turned and walked out, declining the press waiting outside, refusing the pre-written statements of regret. He had no interest in becoming a headline. What he wanted was change, quiet, lasting change. Outside Horizon Hall, a light rain had begun to fall. He didn't raise an umbrella, but there was no sadness in his expression. Upstairs, Naomi stood silently at the window, watching him go. No one saw her cry, but everyone knew that for the first time, she was truly listening. This wasn't a victory for one man. It was the first step of a company relearning what it means to be human, from its own mistakes. Just when it seemed the meeting would end in silence, Malcolm stepped back to the podium, his voice steady, calm but unmistakably clear. He didn't speak of blame anymore. Instead, he spoke of what comes next. "We don't need another speech. We need a system that remembers how to see people." Then and there, he announced the creation of the Equitable Leadership Training Fund, not to fix the past, but to ensure the same wrong would never be repeated. And the first person Malcolm appointed to the program's leadership team was Rowan Mercer, an intern, a witness, a member of a generation that had never truly been given the mic, now chosen to lead. The boardroom erupted, not in polished, rehearsed applause, but in scattered claps that felt real. Naomi bowed her head, not out of shame anymore, but from understanding. Realizing that change had just taken root, not in any official policy, but in one person's choice to act differently. As Rowan stepped onto the stage, hands still trembling slightly, his gaze met Malcolm's, the man who didn't need to say much, yet made an entire institution listen. The final frame of this moment didn't include thunderous applause, just two generations, one that had endured and one that was rising, shaking hands beneath a newly mounted banner. "Lead with fairness." Rowan stood silently for a few seconds in front of the microphone. He wasn't used to the spotlight, let alone the weight of an entire executive board looking at him with expectation. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from a surge of emotion he could barely contain. "When I started my internship at Astoria," he began, voice cracking, "I didn't think I'd even be heard, let alone trusted." His voice broke. He lowered his head, and then he cried. Not out of weakness, but for all the times he had to stay quiet while people like him were overlooked, misjudged, erased from the list of those allowed to make a difference. The room held its breath. From the front row, Naomi Carrington looked up at him. Her gaze, once guarded, now softened, learning quietly how to listen. A senior executive stepped forward, placed a hand gently on Rowan's shoulder, said nothing, just a quiet touch of acknowledgement. And then, The entire hall rose to their feet, not out of protocol, but because they knew. This moment didn't belong to Malcolm or to Naomi. It belonged to a young intern who saw what was wrong and still chose to believe in what's right. In the final frame, time seemed to slow as Rowan lifted his eyes to the banner behind him. Lead with fairness. Tears still shimmered on his cheeks. But this time, they weren't falling because of injustice. They fell because hope had finally begun. Naomi Carrington stepped up to the podium, eyes from every corner of the room fixed on her. Gone was the stiff blazer. Gone was the ever-present confidence. In its place was a quiet weariness, the kind that comes not from defeat, but from the beginning of unlearning. She didn't deliver a scripted apology. She didn't explain, didn't defend. She simply recounted that morning, the way she had decided who Malcolm was before he had even spoken a word. Sometimes, Naomi said, voice steady but stripped of pretense, you don't have to hate someone to hurt them. All it takes is not looking closely, not listening fully, not giving a chance. The room was silent, utterly still. Then the screen behind her lit up, an internal announcement from Astoria. Naomi would step away from her front-facing role and enroll in Reframe, the company's intensive training on equity, diversity, and bias, personally overseen by Rowan Mercer. Not a punishment, a path that now had to be walked. At the back of the room, Malcolm watched quietly. He didn't speak, but his eyes met Naomi's, not as a man who'd been wronged, but as someone willing to believe that real change can start in the very place where the damage was done. Rowan stepped down from the stage. He walked over to Naomi, not to correct her, but to stand beside her. A nod, a handshake, and for the second time that day, the room rose to their feet. Not for ceremony, but for dignity, redefined and reclaimed. Malcolm Rhodes stood, not to conclude, but to step away at exactly the right moment. He didn't extend a handshake, didn't offer a bow, didn't leave behind a business card. Just one sentence, light as air, but weighted like a declaration. Today's silence may become tomorrow's voice. The room fell completely still. Some watched him go as if they'd just witnessed something larger than a businessman, larger than any merger, as if a moral door had quietly swung open at the heart of a company that once believed itself to be progressive. He walked past Naomi, without stopping, but for the first time she didn't look away. She gave a small nod, a quiet period at the end of pride, and an ellipsis at the beginning of humility. At the end of the corridor, Rowan stood holding a half-finished draft of the new training program. He said nothing, just tilted his head gently, as if on behalf of an entire generation once kept on the sidelines, now being invited to rewrite the rules, with the very scars they carried. The glass doors of the Westvale atrium closed behind Malcolm, but his footsteps lingered in the minds of everyone left inside, not because they were loud, but because he had walked through bias without demanding vengeance. One final frame lingers. Malcolm alone in the vast corridor, sunlight from the high windows casting a long shadow behind him. No applause, no spotlight. Just the quiet belief that every silent step taken today might open the way to a tomorrow more just, more human. Just hours after the meeting ended, the media swarmed outside the Summit Gallery, the venue for Astoria Global's annual conference. News of the security footage and the man once mistaken for a delivery worker spread like wildfire. No one from the executive board issued a statement, no press conference, no damage control. They knew. No words could match the weight of the silence Malcolm left behind. One news channel replayed the footage of him leaving, not looking back, not giving a speech, just a single message engraved on the wall behind the podium. Today's silence may become tomorrow's voice. That image flooded social media. A young black student shared the clip with the caption, "First time I've seen silence shake the walls of power." A mother, who once lost her son to unconscious bias, wrote, "Thank you for not shouting, because sometimes the world just needs to see how unshaken quiet can be." Malcolm's story didn't end with a lawsuit, a firing, or a handshake in front of cameras. It ended with something no one expected. He stepped back, so others could step forward. And when Rowan stood before the first training session of the program, titled Rethinking Power, he didn't repeat Malcolm's words as a lesson. He spoke them as a promise. We don't ask for favor, we ask to be seen as human. Though the media had swarmed the Glass Ridge HQ since dawn, waiting for an official statement from the man behind one of the most profound reckonings in corporate history, Malcolm Rhodes remained silent. No press conference, no victory speech. When a reporter caught him in the parking garage and raised a mic asking, "Don't you want to say something about how you forced Astoria to change?" Malcolm paused, turned his head slightly, and replied in a calm, resolute voice, "It's not me who needs to speak. It's the system that needs to change." Then he walked on, leaving behind a flurry of camera shutters and headlines being typed in a rush. That evening, news broadcasts showed Malcolm walking alone down Hudson Avenue, his silhouette stretching long over the rain-slicked pavement. No spotlight, no celebration. He didn't become the center of attention. He became something more, a symbol. In a closed-door meeting among Astoria's top leadership, one voice whispered, "So, have we learned anything yet?" And for the first time in years, the room, where the futures of thousands had been decided, fell completely silent. A different kind of silence, no longer filled with denial, but with the beginning of something far more powerful, the willingness to finally listen. 1 month later, at a press conference held in the Horizon Pavilion, Astoria Global Holdings announced a groundbreaking, unprecedented policy: the launch of the Comprehensive Equity Recruitment and Training Program, funded not by Malcolm Rhodes's money, but by his vision. Malcolm didn't appear on stage, but his name echoed through every slide, every reform, from removing biased professional appearance standards to mandating unconscious bias retraining across the entire HR department. Then came the moment that brought the entire room to a hush. Rowan Mercer was appointed as the company's first ever director of cultural transformation, a role that had never existed before, but had never been more necessary. In his first address, Rowan spoke with a voice trembling with emotion. "I used to think I didn't have enough voice to matter, but today I'm standing here, not because of luck, but because someone chose silence, so I could be heard." The room rose in applause, not for Rowan himself, but for the idea now taking root. At the very back row, Naomi Carrington sat quietly. No one noticed her, but her eyes, clear and steady, watched the stage, no longer looking away. For the first time, she was learning a lesson that no corporate manual had ever taught, a lesson in human worth. Rowan Mercer sat across from the very room that once made him feel the smallest. But this time, the badge on his chest didn't read intern. It read Director of Inclusive Culture Training. A title not handed to him out of pity, but earned, because someone who once chose silence had believed he'd know when it was time to speak. As he stepped onto the stage at the launch of the Reframing Human Perception program, Rowan paused for a moment, scanning the room, once filled with averted eyes, now filled with expectant ones. "That day," he began softly, "I did nothing. But he, just through silence, changed the course of my life." The room held its breath, not because his words were loud, but because everyone in that space knew. This was no longer about Malcolm, or Rowan, or Naomi. This was the birth of a new framework. In the back row, Naomi gave a quiet nod, her first real acknowledgement, not in words, but in the choice to stay seated, to listen, from beginning to end. And what moved the audience most wasn't just that Rowan had been given power, it was what he chose to do with it, to educate, not to retaliate. Naomi Carrington stepped onto the stage of the Undoing the Unconscious, Redefining Modern HR Symposium, facing a sea of curious and skeptical eyes. Gone were the crisp blazer and commanding tone. What remained was a woman learning how to stand again, in the very space shaped by the cracks she once caused. She held the microphone with a slight tremble, then began slowly. "I wasn't fired. I was given a chance to understand something I had never truly seen before. No one forced me up here. I came willingly because I needed to admit it, first and foremost to myself." The room was silent. Behind her, the screen lit up with the words, "Unconscious bias, When prejudice hurts without speaking. Cut to the back of the auditorium. Rowan stood quietly watching. His eyes held no anger, just understanding, the kind that only comes when you witness the person who once hurt you, choosing to begin again. A young attendee approached Naomi and asked, "How did you get past the shame of being publicly called out?" Naomi smiled, faintly but sincerely. "I didn't get past it, I live with it. But this time, I'm not hiding behind privilege anymore." No one applauded, but everyone stood, because not everyone has the courage to return to the place where they once fell and pick up the lesson they left behind. The final shot is a wide, silent frame. Malcolm Rhodes walks out of Astoria Global Holdings beneath the soft light of a fading afternoon. No applause, no flashing cameras, only the long shadow he casts across the marble steps, like a lingering question mark stretched toward tomorrow. He doesn't look back. He doesn't need to, because the battle he faced was never confined to a boardroom. It lives in countless minds that have never stopped to ask, are we truly seeing people or just seeing skin? From inside the glass doors, Rowan watches, but his eyes are no longer those of an intern. They belong to a keeper of the flame, because Malcolm didn't just teach him how to live. He taught him how not to stay silent. A final line fades in over a black screen. Justice doesn't begin with law. It begins with how we choose to see each other. What about you? Have you ever been misunderstood because of where you're from, how you speak, or the color of your skin? Tell us in the comments. We're here to listen, not to judge. And if you believe in a kinder world, hit subscribe. Not for the algorithm, but because every subscription is a promise, we will not stay silent anymore. In a world where even a simple greeting can carry bias, and a glance can cut deeper than any verdict, the story of Malcolm Rhodes was never just about a misunderstanding in a lobby. It was a mirror held up to the hidden fractures in how we treat one another. He didn't respond with anger. He didn't retaliate. Malcolm chose silence, but not as surrender. It was the calm of someone who understood that the real storm wasn't inside a single person. It was embedded deep within a system. When the footage was played, it didn't just make a receptionist lower her head, it compelled an entire corporation to rewrite its human resources policy. The once overlooked black intern, Rowan Mercer, stepped onto the stage, not as a token, but as a representative of a new generation. And Naomi, the one who had faltered, chose to rise and relearn. This story reminds us that even the smallest of actions can be the first piece in a much bigger change. Sometimes, you don't need to shout to be heard. You just need to stand firm, keep walking, and let the truth speak for itself. And the lesson it leaves behind is crystal clear. Instead of looking for someone to blame, be the one who begins again. And if you carry the privilege of silence, use it to lift the voices of those who cannot yet speak.